It has been quite the roller coaster ride these past months, as Reshma has aptly described. And there has been much learning, real takeaways, and many, many moments that will remain with me. The silence of the night broken by laughter laced with fatigue and hope as we trundled to our pantry community table and dipped into the sensually soft rasam idli. The disappointed and panicked sighs when cancellations piled high. The bucket full of tears when the immersive installation became a reality that moved others as well. And of course, witnessing with TM and our team the mounting of our new facade, designed and imagined by Zake, the talented young graffiti artist. From a 6-day online festival initiated in 2020 to a 3-week marathon this year, I think we can safely say that we have traveled some distance. In these times when support for the arts is so difficult, I cannot express enough how grateful and moved I am for the generosity and vision of the Bajaj Foundation, who have come on board to support Shraddha 2022. So thank you sincerely, Minal and Neeraj. And to the BNP Paribas India Foundation, our longtime partners, who also support a major part of our year-round programming. Thank you, Manisha. And before I say more, 2 things. First, Dr. Guha, what a privilege. Thank you for being here. And I also want to formally thank our resident curator, T.M. Krishna, and the resilient Ramya, without who this would not have been possible. Thank you for this week and helping us at G5A to connect or reconnect with some of the best in talent and thought. There are very few master artists who have the clarity and courage to address problematic and fraught issues as an integral part of their creative practice. TM, you show us that it is possible and give us all hope. How do I describe TM? He truly has the magical combination of heart, intellect, and talent, all in generous dollops. And thankfully, he has age on his side as well, as we have amply discussed these past 2 nights. And insatiable energy and hope. And lest you get too comfortable, either as fan or detractor, he has a wicked, wicked sense of humor. And on my part, I'm really happy to say that from monosyllables, we have now graduated to paragraphs. Thank you, TM. I've always known that working at G5A is a huge privilege. And the past 2 weeks of Shraddha 2022 have truly reinforced that. But it is a privilege that comes with an even bigger responsibility. What is the work we present here, and what do we leave out? Who do we converse with, and who we don't? What do we foreground, and what do we gently but firmly push away? Everyone in our team knows that we carry this enormous burden, but I'm so moved that everyone carries it lightly and in a way that is now internalized fully. Thank you so much, Team G5A. My hope for Shraddha 2022 is that each one of us shares in the conversations and presentations in a full and deep way, leaving no room for cynicism or ambivalence. That we are open and agree to challenge ourselves and step out of our comfort zones every once in a while. That we pledge to support independent art and artists and help build an ecosystem that is rooted yet contemporary, honest, and creative. That we carry this idea and energy exchange with us as we traverse our individual worlds and commit to taking a position, picking a side no matter the implications or consequences. That we tackle indifference or fear with a sense of quiet fortitude and keep the whole hope alive no matter what. I always come back to Leonard Bernstein, who says, the point is art never stopped a war and never got anybody a job. That was never its function. Art cannot change events, but it can change people. It can affect people so that they are changed, because people are changed by art, enriched, ennobled, encouraged. They then act in a way that may affect the course of events by the way they vote, they behave, the way they think. So thank you most of all to all of you for being here at the G5A warehouse and helping us build this ecosystem. Thank you. TM.
Good evening, and I'm glad that we're finally here on the first day of Shurat, today and tomorrow's. I won't take too much of your time. Just want to say, give you an idea what went behind the curation. Many of the words that came to my mind when I thought of curating are words I think many of us here are grappling with. We do live in times when identities, national, social, personal, are all in conflict with one another. And we struggle with our relationship with these different identities within ourselves. What does it mean to be Indian? What does it mean to be Hindu? What does it mean to live in a certain community? My address. All these seem to conflict with one another, and we are unable to reconcile it. Therefore, when this whole idea of a festival came, the first word that came to me was citizenry. What does it mean to be a citizen? And I think many times that word is actually enveloped in all these different identities because there's no one notion of that. We also live in times when our neighborhoods, not just the larger environmental question, but also the specific questions of where we live, about the water we drink, about who gets to drink that water, who doesn't get water, our sense of civics, our sense of access, are all being debated within this notion of identities. And in this, unfortunately, the people having the major share of the conversation are those like us, those who are not on the margins, but those who have the privilege to have these conversations. And this week is about finding ways in which we can ask difficult questions of every one of these interconnected issues, which means we hopefully can learn beyond our limitations. So one of the most important things that I think is relevant for these 4 days is that this is not a festival of famous people saying famous things. This is about voices that matter. Old, new, doesn't matter. Known, unknown, doesn't matter. All that matters is, can the experience of listening to these voices change the way we think, we feel, and we relate? So I'm thrilled that we have been able to create a space where new musical bands with new ideas, can perform. A space where we have a Ramchandra Guha, we have Aruna Roy, we have Pale Nanna from Chennai coast, and we have Pandurang Turbakre from here, and we have Beswara Wilson. We also have Tista, we have Nain Jyotahari, we have a film by Meher Fadnavis, Lords of Lockdown, and we have Prahlad Tipania. And we can also listen to someone who we very rarely get to listen to, a margin of a different sort, Mukul Shivputra. We've many forgotten that he even exists. So this is about diverse voices. This is about different resonances. And this is about knowing the unknown, not outside, but within ourselves. It gives me immense pleasure now to invite Ramachandra Guha to please deliver the keynote address. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, an explanation as to why I'm speaking sitting. I sprained my ankle 2 weeks ago, and it's still healing. But actually, it's probably more appropriate because what I'm going to talk about is, I think, it's more reflective than declamatory. Though, I could give a bhashan from there, which is generally my style. Probably it was appropriate and that I had this injury and I can't speak standing. Now, I'm here for 2 reasons. One is that Krishna is an artist I greatly admire and I'm privileged to call my friend. And the other is that Mumbai is my favorite city. Okay, favorite Indian city. And I've got to speak on, I've called my lecture Patriotism versus Jingoism, and it's kind of a defense of Indian pluralism. But again, while listening to Reshma and Anuradha, I realized that there's a third and compelling reason that I'm here, in that this wonderful series of events is sponsored by the Jamnalal Bajaj Foundation. And Jamnalal Bajaj has been an important part of my professional journey. So I'm going to tell a story about Jamnalalji or Jamnalalji's family, and then a story about Krishna, both of which are in some odd way linked to the serious and portentous title of my talk, Patriotism versus Jingoism. So first, Jamnalalji. My life was changed by an early encounter with the works of the anthropologist Verrier Elwin. When I was an MA student, an indifferent student of economics, when I chanced upon the work of Verrier Elwin and became a sociologist and anthropologist and later historian, and Elwin's life was transformed by Jamnalalji. Elwin, some of you may not know who he was, but he was a brilliant scholar from Oxford, the son of the British Bishop of Sierra Leone, who came to India and became the foremost student, interpreter, and activist on behalf of our Adivasi peoples. And he was set on this path by Jamnalalji. So when he came to India, he met Gandhi, wanted to leave the church, left the church, spent some time in some of these areas probably, in some of the chawls of central Mumbai, wanted to work with Dalits. And then Jamnalalji told him that Dalits are our problem, the problem of the Hindus. Emancipating Dalits, ending discrimination is not a problem of a foreigner like you, but we know very little about our Adivasis. So Jamnalalji actually sent him to Mandla in Madhya Pradesh, which changed his life. And many years later, I wrote a biography of Gandhi, where Jamnalalji figures centrally. And of course, he was Gandhi's fifth son, and a very remarkable figure, in many, many ways, as a philanthropist, as an activist, as a thinker, as a deeply selfless and caring human being. And if he and Mahadev Desai had not died in the early 40s, maybe our history would have been very different. Because in many ways, the role of Nehru and Patel in building modern India is well known and widely recognized. But Mahadev and Jamnalalji were as important to Gandhi and understood different things from Gandhi and maybe complementary things. Now, in the course of my research, I found some which I couldn't use in my biography, I found a fascinating correspondence in the papers of Jamnalal's son, Kamal Nayan Bajaj, where Kamal Nayan and his sister Madalsa had gone to see Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan in Kabul in the 1960s, when he had been exiled from Pakistan. And they were keen to bring him back to India. I mean, it's an extraordinary story, and I was fortunate to be able to share it with Rahul Bajaj before he died. I never knew Mr. Bajaj, Rahul Bajaj, but I had the privilege of this correspondence where, Ghaffar Khan and the Pathans were in some ways the forgotten victims of partition. And it was always felt that the Congress threw them to the wolves. And then, of course, here is a man, Ghaffar Khan, who spends 15 years in prison under the British and an equal time under the Pakistanis. And it's a Hindu couple, a Hindu brother and sister rather, Madalsa and who was then Narayan, not Bajaj, and Kamal and Bajaj, who then go and comfort him in Kabul where he's in exile, and then of course bring him to India in 1969 and so on. So, that I'm part of something which in some way is, made possible because of the heritage and legacy and extraordinary vision of Jamnalalji is very moving for me. But I'm also going to tell a story about Krishna, which is not Gandhian at all. And it's unscripted. My talk is going to be rather serious, but listening to all of you, listening to Anuradha and seeing Krishna here, it's a story of one of several concerts of Krishna that I've heard. This was in a Hoysala era temple somewhere between Hassan and Chikmagalur. The temple is in a village called Belwadi. And some of you would have been to Belur and Halibid. Belwadi is a jewel. It's a small, intact temple, but it's utterly gorgeous. And Krishna gave a concert there. And he was, the DT was behind him, and he sang. And some of us went from Bangalore to hear him. So the village folks strolled in and heard him too. And after the concert, we went to the home of Captain Gopinath, who had organized the concert, who's a great lover of carnatic music and a friend of Krishna's, and had dinner after the concert. So the music was magical, as you would expect. And at the dinner, after singing for 3 hours, Krishna was behind the bar, serving all of us liquor, and certainly having 1 whiskey for every 3 he dispensed. But after that, he joined us at dinner, and this is the real story. And at that dinner was with, like my wife Sujata and I had someone who had come from Bangalore, was a lover of Carnatic music, a retired civil servant called K. Jayaraj, who is associated with the Bangalore Gayana Samaja. And he had been trying unsuccessfully to get Krishna for the last 5 years. So clearly, he wasn't as successful as Anuradha and Reshma. Forget a whole curation of a week. Even for one concert, Krishna would not go. So he told him, he said, why haven't you come? I've been asking you every year. He said, look, the last time I sang 8 years ago, after my concert, first the secretary spoke, then the executive member spoke, then the vice president spoke, and then the minister of culture of the Karnataka government spoke. And he said, that's an insult to my music. It's not to me. You can have as many speeches beforehand if you want, but the audience wants to go away with the music. So at this, Jayaraj said, Krishna, please come. My Bangalore guy, it is my institution, please come. It is 110 years old. To which Krishna said, my music is 600 years old and you insulted it. So that's the kind of person he is, and that's the kind of legacy which Jamnalal Bajaj carried. It's a legacy, as was implied in the prefatory remarks, but I'll say it out front, which in many ways is under threat, and that is going to be the burden of my talk today. And I'm going to begin with, again, in the spirit of Gandhi and Jamnalal Bajaj, by reminding us of the founding principles of Indian nationalism. Now, nationalism as we know it was born in 19th century Europe. It's not an ancient thing. It doesn't come to us from our Vedic ancestors, nor does it come to the Muslim world from Prophet Muhammad, nor does it come to Israel today from the Jews of the 2nd millennium BC. It is a modern invention invented by the Europeans in the 19th century, and the founding and guiding principles of nationalism, as it was conceived and formulated and enacted in 19th century Europe, were one nation, one religion, one language, one enemy. So if you look at, there's some wonderful histories of British nationalism. I'd recommend a book by Linda Colley called Britons Forging the Nation. There's also a great history of French nationalism by Eugene Weber called Peasants into Frenchmen, which actually show how people of a certain territory were brought together. Their boundaries were defined. Their political ethos was constructed around the sentiment, everyone must speak the same language. So the different dialects of the provinces of France were standardized. Welsh and Scottish and Gaelic were erased. So same language, same religion. So in England, if you were a Protestant, you were really a first-class citizen. Catholics were stigmatized, Jews were persecuted. You go across the channel to France, it's the reverse. It's the Catholics who are essentially have a natural born affinity to be primary French citizens, and it's the Protestants who are persecuted. So one language, one religion, and one enemy. So in the case of France, it's Britain. In the case of Britain, it's France, and so on and so forth. And that's the principle on which nationalism was constructed and taken forward. And that, of course, is the principle of Pakistani nationalism and also of Israeli nationalism. Ironically, that two states that abhor each other, that have long detested one another, are constructed around the principle of one religion, one language, and one enemy, the Arabs for the Israelis and the Indians for the Pakistanis. Now, what is extraordinary about Indian nationalism is that it evolved its own distinctive and different template. It did not privilege one language, and of course, That's why we have all these languages on our rupee note. Or one religion, or indeed one enemy. Uh, Gandhi's closest friend was an Englishman, in fact, an English Christian priest, Charles Freer Andrews. If you admired Gandhi, as many Indians contemporaries of his did, you called him Gandhi ji or Bapu. If you had reservations about Gandhi, you referred to him only as Mr. Gandhi. So Jinnah and Ambedkar, for example, would never call him Mahatma, which is fair enough. But in adult life, there was only one individual who called Gandhi by his first name, Mohan, and that was C.F. Andrews. That was the depth of the friendship. And when Andrews died in 1940 in Calcutta, uh, he's buried actually in the Lower Circular Road Cemetery along with Indians, not in the big grand European cemetery in Park Street. And one of the things I always do when I go to Kolkata is to actually call at Charlie Andrews' grave. But when he died, Gandhi gave a beautiful statement about how to honor Andrews' legacy. And he said, all the misdeeds of England in India will be forgotten, but not one of the good deeds of Charlie Andrews will always be remembered. And we owe it to Andrews, and we owe it to our two peoples to carry on, once India is free, to carry on our friendship in the spirit of C.F. Andrews. So that is the kind of distinctive aspect of nationalism as conceived not only by Gandhi, by Tagore, by Azad, by many, many other people who were part of the freedom struggle. Now, European nationalism saw loyalty to your country through the prism of identity, linguistic and religious identity, coupled with hatred for somebody else's country. Gandhi's nationalism, or for convenience I'm calling it Gandhi's nationalism, let's call it Indian nationalism of that kind, Indian nationalism 1.0, conceived of nationalism not as a set of identities, but as a set of values. And 100 years ago, in 1922, Gandhi defined Swaraj. There are very few definitions of Swaraj that you'll find in Gandhi's writings. One of the rare instances comes from 1922, where he said, Swaraj, in my conception, is a bed with 4 sturdy posts. And these 4 posts are non-violence, abolition of untouchability, Hindu-Muslim harmony, and the promotion of Khaddar as a kind of a way of economic self-reliance. And he said all 4 posts have to be sturdy. If one is weak, the whole edifice of the bed will collapse. Hindu-Muslim harmony, abolition of untouchability, non-violence, and economic self-reliance. And in some ways, these 4 pillars of Swaraj found a full and you might say definitive elaboration in the Indian Constitution. Of course, Gandhi did not write a word of the Indian Constitution. He was busy walking through rural Bengal and then fasting while the Constitution was being debated. But the Constitution itself was the product of decades of thinking and reflecting on how to build a just and fair and inclusive society, and what would be the principles of that. So, Indian nationalism 1.0 is, to underline a point I've already made, is based on a system of values, not on identities. And these values include democracy, which is the playing out of non-violence in the political domain, so that you choose your leaders freely, not through the ballot box rather than through the bullet. Social equality, as in the abolition of caste and gender distinctions, which was extremely radical in a society such as ours, so steeped in patriarchy and, of course, the widespread practice of untouchability. Religious and linguistic pluralism, so that was a central principle of the Constitution, and of course, economic self-reliance, and a federal system in which there was a kind of symbiotic relationship between the center and the states. Now, I call this model of Indian nationalism 1.0. Given it the I see it as constitutional patriotism. Now, that term, for those of you who are students of social science, has also been used by the great German sociologist Jürgen Habermas, but I use it slightly differently. Uh, Constitutional patriotism is a patriotism that bases itself on the values of the Constitution. And it has 5 fundamental features, or 5 that I want to underline in my talk. There will be others that we may add to this. So the first fundamental feature of constitutional patriotism is the acknowledgement and appreciation of our inherited and shared diversity. So we are not one people with one language, one religion, one identity, one ideology, etc., etc. We are a nation of many kinds of peoples, and we must acknowledge this diversity and affirm it and actually glory in it. And I'm going to give you 2 quotes from great writers about how they saw this appreciation of diversity. The first is from Tagore, and it goes, "No one knows at whose call so many streams of men flowed in restless tides from places unknown and were lost in one sea, here, that is in India. Here, Aryan and non-Aryan, Dravidian, Chinese, the bands of Saka and the Hunas and the Pathan and the Mughal have become combined in one body." That's Tagore. It's actually a quote which Nehru was particularly fond of using. But my second quote, because I don't want to only quote a famous writer, and certainly not only a famous Bengali writer, because much of my life has been, professional life has been spent combating the Bengali hegemony of Indian history writing. So I want to juxtapose to Tagore some remarks of the great Kannada writer and polymath Kota Shivaram Kalanth, who once said, "It is impossible to talk of Indian culture as if it is a monolithic object." I repeat, it is impossible to talk of Indian culture as if it is a monolithic object. Now, Kalanth had heard people talk about Aryan culture. I mean, this is, Kalanth died, by the way, 27 years ago. So he wrote this in the 1970s, a long time ago. He had people talk about Aryan culture, and he said, do these people who talk about something unitary, singular, as definite as Aryan culture, do they recognize what transformations this Aryan culture has undergone after reaching India? And then he writes, and I quote him, "Indian culture today is so varied as to be called cultures. The roots of this culture go back to ancient times, and it has developed through contact with many races and peoples. Hence, among its many ingredients, it is impossible to say surely what is native and what is alien, what is borrowed out of love and what has been imposed by force." I repeat, hence, among its many ingredients, it is impossible to say surely what is native and what is alien, what is borrowed out of love and what has been imposed by force. If we view Indian culture thus, we realize there is no place for chauvinism. Now, this is current, and it's a wonderful, elaboration of what Indian culture or cultures are. Now, what this tells you is that according to that ideal of constitutional patriotism, no type of Indian is superior to another type of Indian by virtue of the language they speak or the faith they profess, or indeed the party they vote for. Indianness is defined by allegiance to the values of the Constitution, not by birth or by blood. That's the first feature of constitutional patriotism. The second, and I think here there would be a debate between, shall we say, Gandhi on one side and Ambedkar and Nehru on the other. As I see it, the second feature of constitutional patriotism is that patriotism can be practiced at many levels. So, like charity, it begins at home. Love your street, love your village, love your taluk, love your district, Love your city, love your country, love your state as much as you love your country. So it can be practiced at different levels. So it is Mahim and central Mumbai and Pune and this part of coastal Maharashtra and the Deccan and of course and then India. So it can be practiced at different levels. And I think this is something which the Europeans have embraced now. I remember giving a talk at the university town of Leuven in Belgium, which incidentally is the birthplace of the great Indian economist Jean Drèze. And in the city hall in Leuven, there were 5 flags flying. So there was the flag of the town, the county, the region, because Belgium is divided into 2 regions, the country, and the European Union. So that's how patriotism can operate at many levels. And these multiple identities are not clashing but complementary. One does not override the other. It's not as if my Kannada identity overrides my identity as a resident of Bangalore, or that the Indian identity overrides all of these. They are clashing but not. They are not clashing but contemporary. Hence, we have state flags, and we should have state flags, though they are actually technically probably not legal. And I would be very surprised if any judge in a high court or a Supreme Court would have the guts to say you can have state flags. But if you are in my hometown on November the 1st, which is the anniversary of the creation of Karnataka from 4 different zones, you will see the state flag, which is red and yellow, being flown proudly, particularly by auto rickshaw drivers. Okay, so I think that's the second aspect of constitutional patriotism, that it can be, patriotism is enacted at all levels, which are complementary, not clashing. The third is that the third of 5 features that I'm singling out in this model of Indian nationalism is that no nation, no state, no religion, no culture is perfect or flawless, and no leader too. When I wrote my Gandhi biography, there was a review, very perceptive review by Sunil Khilnani, whose work some of you know, and he made a point which actually summed up what Gandhi was about. Alas, it was a brilliant and very perceptive point, and alas, it was too late for me to incorporate it in my own book. He's an old friend of mine. I wish he'd had the courtesy to tell me over a drink, a few months before. But the point he made was this. He said, while reading my biography, he said, Gandhi was not just fighting the British. Gandhi was fighting India. So India was flawed. The way we treated women, the way we treated Dalits, our wasteful practices of consumption, our inability to resolve our religious differences, our craven faith in charismatic leaders, India was flawed. So Gandhi was fighting India as much as he was fighting the British. It's a very perceptive remark that Khilnani makes, because it tells you a lot about Gandhi. It also tells you about how we should really see, that no religion, no. I mean, I was just thinking, what we are. I mean, I don't really want to talk too much about specific examples of what is going on today, but the idea that any religion is perfect, any nation is perfect, is just so. The idea that we are our primary, the group we belong to is absolutely flawless, is so antithetical to how as I said, our founding fathers and mothers saw India. India was a work in progress. India was grappling against colonial exploitation, but was also coming to terms, belatedly coming to terms with all the terrible and inhumane practices in India itself. That Indians were barbaric towards other Indians, and that had to be corrected. So that's the third feature. The fourth feature, which is linked to this, which I've already anticipated, is the ability to feel shame at the failures of your nation and state, and the desire and religion and culture, and the desire and will to correct them. Now, there's a very long tradition of Indian social reform, which goes back, again, to give the Bengalis their due, probably starts with Ram Mohan Roy. But then rapidly shifts westward, and then, of course, you have Phule and Tarabai Shinde and Gokhale, and then of course then comes Gandhi and Ambedkar and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and so on and so forth. So there's a long tradition, there's a 2-century long tradition of social reformers who recognized that there were problems with us, that Hindus were riven by caste and gender inequalities. And of course, so were the Muslims. So you had a parallel line of Muslim social reformers, arguably not as influential at that stage as the Hindu social reformers, but that's a separate question. So that's the fourth feature of patriotism, that you recognize you have your culture or your religion or your nation has flaws, and you have the ability and the will and the desire to correct them in the light of reason and justice and what it takes to be human in this complex and interdependent world. And the fifth and feature of what I'm calling Indian nationalism Mark I or constitutional patriotism is the ability to be rooted in one's culture and country while being willing to learn from other cultures and countries. If you look at to say Ambedkar, for example, what Ambedkar's studies and travels in the United States particularly, but also in Britain, did to shape him as a great reformer and emancipator. Likewise with Nehru or Patel, or even if you didn't travel. I mentioned Phule. One of the most extraordinary things about Phule, which was pointed out to me by my friend Kumar Ketkar, a resident of the city, was that his book Ghulamgiri, written in the 1860s, is dedicated to Lincoln, and it's about those who are fighting slavery in the United States. Here is he in Pune, from a very humble background, from a backward caste background, and he knows about what's happening in America. And he's inspired by that. That is kind of very emblematic and typical of the Indian reformers and nationalists of that time. That you're rooted in your culture and country. Could anyone say, or someone else, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay? I've just been reading a wonderful biography of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, appropriately written by an American male. Okay, it's a fantastic book. It'll be out next year, I hope. The author is Nico Slate. He's an American historian who's written the first proper biography of someone I consider the most remarkable Indian woman of modern times. And he's talked about her travels in Japan, in China, in America, what they learned from her, what she learned from them. So that was kind of this last feature of constitutional patriotism is you're rooted in your culture. Kamala Devi had probably certainly been to every state, possibly every district in India. I suspect she spoke at least 5 languages. And that was probably an underestimate, right? But she didn't think that, there was nothing to learn from other countries, other cultures, other peoples. She went ahead and got what was needed to make her own country a more humane and caring and, livable place. And that was true of that entire generation, in varying ways. It was true of Nehru, of Gandhi, of Tagore, of Phule, of Ambedkar, etc., of Ram Manohar Lohia, who had to leave Berlin when Hitler, came to power. Jayaprakash Narayan, who became a socialist while, working with fruit workers in California. So, all of this. Okay. Now, this model of nationalism that I've talked about is, of course, very much in the past. It's in tatters and on the retreat. And now there is a new model that is ascendant, dominant, and that's what we know associated with the BJP and the RSS. That's the model we call Hindutva. What are its features? So I've given you just to refresh our memory, as I understand it, 5 fundamental features of Indian nationalism Mark I were the acknowledgement and appreciation of our acquired and inherited diversity. Secondly, the recognition of multiple levels at which patriotism is practiced or can be practiced, should be practiced. The recognition that no nation, no state, no religion is flawless and perfect. Fourth, the ability and willingness to recognize your failures and your deficiencies and have the courage and the energy to correct them. And finally, the ability to be rooted in your culture and country, but be willing to learn from other countries and cultures and countries. Now, this model is in tatters and it's been replaced by an alternate model, which I'm calling Hindutva, which is what they call it themselves. And what are its fundamental features? Uh, First, the privileging of a single religion, Hinduism. Uh, and in the papers yesterday in Bangalore, I read a story about how the MP of Mysore has started a campaign to have the design of a bus stop changed because the top of the bus stop resembles, according to him, the dome of a mosque. Now, but that is, you may think it's ridiculous and absurd, but it's not. It's deadly serious. That's the way you affirm that this is a Hindu country. That's the way you frighten the majority community into voting for your party in the next election in Karnataka, which is due in a few months. So the privileging of a single religion, this is a Hindu country, not anybody else's country. Hindu have, according to this new form of nationalism. Secondly, the privileging of a single language, namely Hindi, which is really taken on it's been supercharged, particularly after 2019, and the admittance of Amit Shah into the cabinet, because he's in some ways much more a thoroughgoing ideologue than the Prime Minister, and that's really very much part of it. I mean, you hear talk about it. I don't need to give you details of the plans that are afoot, not just to impose it in southern and eastern states, but to have modern scientific education, conducted in Hindi and so on. And finally, the privileging of a common external enemy, Pakistan. So, in all these respects, the new model of Indian nationalism mimics the new model of Indian nationalism, which is so visible in the 21st century, mimics 19th century European nationalism. But the Europeans have moved on. I mean, if you look at France and Germany and their relations compared to what they were all through the early modern period, or if you look at the construction of the European Union, or you look at the example of Belgium, which I already gave you. Now, there are some other aspects to this new form of nationalism, apart from privileging one religion, one language, and one enemy, that I'd like to briefly mention. And that's the crushing of dissent. The branding of all critics as anti-national. And this, of course, goes back to the Ur text of the RSS, which is M.S. Golwalkar's bunch of thoughts, which identifies three enemies to the nation: Muslims, Christians, and communists. Now, Muslims and Christians are still enemies in the current perception, and communists does not mean communists. By the way, I've been an anti-Marxist longer than I've been anti-Hindutva. Simply because when I was a student in the 1980s and combating Marxism, for, among other things, dismissing environmentalism as a bourgeois deviation from the class struggle, there were no Hindutva around. No, but according to this regime, I'm a communist, a Naxalite, and God knows what else. So, branding of all dissent as anti-national, and really getting after everyone who doesn't agree with you. Right now, I rarely watch. There's a great deficiency in my cultural upbringing. I rarely watch films. But one of the films I watched at the recommendation of my friend Munni Kabir was called Newton. And some of you would have seen Newton, right? And I liked the film. And it had one line, which kind of a throwaway line, which sums up, the kind of nationalist frenzy we are living through. I mean, I don't know who the scriptwriter was, whether he or she understood the whole import of the line. It's a throwaway line in the I can't remember whether it's in the mouth of the main character or someone else, but the line goes like this: ये देश झंडा और झंडा से चलता है. ये देश flag and stick, झंडा और झंडा से चलता है. Otherwise, you just stand in line. That's it. And I think that sums up the kind of punitive and paranoid form of Indian nationalism that we are now witnessing. Now, is this nationalism, or should we give it another name? And I'm going to give it another name. I'm going to say, let's call this Jingoism. Let's say that nationalism was the mother lode or the father lord, which gave birth to two children who, often like two children, are radically opposed in how they look, feel, act, think, express themselves. One child I'm calling, or one descendant of nationalism, I'm calling patriotism, which I've explained to you, and the other I'm calling jingoism. And I'm going to elaborate this distinction. I'm going to take recourse, since I'm speaking in English, which, as Rajaji reminded us many, many years ago, is the Indian language, because if Saraswati gave birth to language, she gave birth to the English language too. So, in that spirit, since I'm speaking in English, I'm going to offer you two definitions from the Oxford English Dictionary. First, the OED's definition of patriotism. So this is how the OED defines patriotism, or a patriot. A patriot is a person who loves his or her country, especially one who is ready to support its freedoms and rights and to defend it against enemies or detractors. Who loves his or her country and is ready to support its freedoms and rights. Its freedoms and rights. Contrast this to the OED's definition of a jingoist. Who is a jingoist? One who brags of his country's preparedness to fight and generally advocates or favors a bellicose policy in dealing with foreign powers, a blustering or blatant nationalist, a chauvinist. So, I think this brings out very clearly the distinction between the founding model of Indian nationalism and the model that now seeks to supplant it. Patriotism is, or was, and maybe one day will be, suffused with love and understanding. Jingoism is motivated by hate and revenge. The features of jingoism are, first, as I've already argued, the belief that one's religion, culture, nation are infallible and supreme. Second, the demonizing of critics as anti-national, as desdrohis. And third, the violence and lumpenization of public discourse and public behavior. I mean, that's, I think, also absolutely crucial. So Hinduism, I beg your pardon, Hindutva is not patriotism, it is jingoism. Hindutva is not patriotism, it is jingoism. It seeks to obliterate Indian pluralism in favor of one religion, one language, indeed, one leader too. Now, as a citizen of a certain age, molded by a certain kind of background, I might, as I already have, criticize what I've called jingoism. But as a scholar, I'm obliged to understand it. Why is jingoism ascendant today, in India today? And of course, they ascended in many, many different parts of the world, but let's stick to our country for the moment. And I'm going to give you four crucial reasons why jingoism of the Hindutva kind is so influential and visible and powerful in India today, which go beyond its ideology, which I've already talked about. The first is the hypocrisy of the Indian left, and by which I mean the communist left. One of the great tragedies of Indian political discourse over the last 50, 60 years has been the disappearance of the socialist tradition, and the capture of what we call the left by the communists. Just as nationalism has two children, patriotism and jingoism, socialism has two children, democratic socialism and revolutionary Marxism. And the great socialist tradition of India was killed by its own people, partly because of their sectarianism, partly because it became family rule. But people like, in this city, if you think of Minal Gore, Madhu Dandavate, Pramila Dandavate, they came from a different kind of background, and I'm exempting them from my criticism when I talk about the hypocrisy of the left. I'm talking about the hypocrisy of communist left, which has been much more influential than the socialists in politics, because they've enjoyed power in 3 states for long periods of time, and among the intellectual and artistic class too. Most Indian intellectuals who consider themselves leftists have no clue about the Indian socialist, and artists too. They have no clue about the Indian socialist tradition. They have some vague identification with the romantic, idealistic, naive identification with some form of communist internationalism. And in many ways, I believe, and I've written this for a very long time. I mean, as I said, I've been anti-Marxist long before I've been anti-Hindutva. And for at least 20 years, I pointed out how, for the Indian left, by which I mean Indian communist left, they always loved another country more than India. It used to be Russia, then it became China, then it was Vietnam, then Cuba. For a brief period, it was even Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez became their great redeemer. And at many times in our history, this has been shown, of course, 42, 62, 96, but generally in their conduct, I think, and the socialists were different. People like JP and Lohia and Kamala Devi and all the other names I mentioned, they loved their country, they wanted to correct its flaws, they were radical egalitarians, but they had a sense of building this country, not of some credulous worship of what Russia and China allegedly were. So I think the left, and I think here the Hindutva critique of the left is spot on. That they've always loved some other country, the communist left, more than India. That's the first, I think, reason for the rise of Hindutva or Jingoism in recent decades. The second reason is the corruption of the Congress party, and how a great party in freedom struggle was reduced to one family. One of my mentors, the great Indian sociologist Andre Bete, told me many, many years ago, and this is again, in private conversation, I've used this remark before, but I'll repeat it for you. He told me this when possibly Rajiv Gandhi was still in power, not even before Sonia Gandhi entered politics. He said, the posthumous reputation of Nehru reverses the biblical injunction. In the Bible, it is said, the sins of the father will be visited on 7 successive generations. In the case of Nehru, the sins of 7 successive generations have been retrospectively visited on him. And, every generation has been worse than Nehru, not just in terms of intelligence, but insight, understanding of this country, energy, imagination, and above all, ability to move the people. I have some sympathy for Rahul Gandhi. He's a nice man, but he's surrounded by chamchas. I actually met one of them at the Bengaluru airport today. And I went and introduced myself to him, and he was rather embarrassed that someone would take a photograph of me, and it'll be conveyed back to the boss that, essentially, in India has become more communal, but it's also become less feudal. Young Indians detest the idea of dynasty, of entitlement over 5 generations. And I think, in many ways, carrying on with family rule is just playing into the hands of Narendra Modi. I mean, what Narendra Modi wants most of all is for Rahul Gandhi to be head of the Congress. And again, this is a belief that many congressmen believe. I was in my favorite place in Bangalore, which is Koshi's Parades Cafe, about 6 weeks ago. And a congressman came and introduced himself to me. He's a member of the Karnataka Legislative Assembly. He said he read my stuff and so on. He said, if only Rahul Gandhi would say, I am not a prime ministerial candidate, we would have a chance in 2024. But of course, he will not say it because mummy will not let him say it. And his sycophants are all telling him, you are down. In fact, Kharge was elected president of the Congress party. The next day, he went to the Bharat Jodo Yatra and said, in 2024, Rahul Gandhi will lead the opposition to victory. And they're totally out of touch with how Indians think and believe. I mean, I think, and of course, why this is happening and so on is a different thing, but the corruption and the degradation of the Congress party is absolutely much more so than the hypocrisy of the left. And this capture by a single party, a family which refuses to go, is absolutely, fundamental to understanding why we are faced with this monster in the form of right-wing jingoism in India today. The third reason, of course, is global. There's a kind of rise of nationalism and jingoism everywhere. I mean, in America, in Britain, in France, in Hungary, in China, in Turkey. The sense that, it's not only Modi's acolytes who think that their country will be Vishwaguru. So do Trump's acolytes, Erdogan's acolytes, Putin's acolytes, Orban's acolytes, Xi's acolytes, etc., etc., etc. So this is, it's a global kind of epidemic of which, of course, we have a particularly virulent form. And finally, not to be discounted, is the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in our own backyard. You know, if you look again, as I said, as a citizen, I have a certain view and a certain sense of dismay and despair at what's happening. As a historian, I have to understand it in a more thoroughgoing and less superficial way. And South Asia is defined by, or South Asia is peopled by two Buddhist majoritarian states, Sri Lanka and Myanmar, and actually you should add Bhutan as the third, and two Islamic majoritarian states, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And India, in its origins, not just through its constitution, but certainly the first decade and a half under the leadership of Nehru, tried proudly and honorably to stay apart. But now we are approximating the South Asian norm. We are becoming like everyone else around us. So the failures of the left and the Congress, have opened up a space for the BJP, and the global and regional rise of Jingoism and fundamentalism has encouraged it and furthered it to where it is today. Now, I want to end by making 2 points. The first is, I want to very briefly take apart the claim that Hindutva is authentically Indian. Now, I've already quoted to you Tagore and Karant and others on whether there is anything authentically Indian or authentically Hindu. But if you look at the political philosophy and political practice of Hindutva from a historical lens, historical and comparative lens, you would have to conclude that there is nothing Indian about it. It's 50% based on medieval Islamic political theology, and I'll explain that in a bit, and 50% based on 19th century European nationalism, which I've already talked about. So it's a mixture of Muslim and Christian, despite the hatred of Muslims and Christians. And I should explain the first part. I mean, European nationalism I've talked about at some length. But I should explain the first part. And this is again an insight I owe to my late teacher, Professor Dharma Kumar of the Delhi School of Economics. And this goes back to the days of the Babri Masjid demolition when she first started talking about this. If you look at the model of the RSS, it's actually very akin to that practiced in medieval Islamic states, where you had three categories of people. You had the first-class citizens, who were Sunni Muslims. You had the second-class citizens, who were Jews and Christians, people of the book, who shared many of the same prophets as the Muslims, but did not acknowledge that Muhammad was the last and the greatest. And so they were allowed, by virtue of sharing some prophets, by virtue of being born in the same desert region, of being people of the book, they were allowed to live and work under certain conditions. So if you're a shoemaker or a barber or a merchant or a nomadic pastoralist and you were Jewish, fine. So long as you kept your head on the water, you did not militantly argue with the rulers about their practice, and you were clear that you would never become general, Supreme Court justice, vice chancellor, king, vizier, etc., etc. And that really is the model. It's actually, there was a third category of people who were the kafirs, who of course had to be eliminated, but leave that for the moment. So really what you have in this so-called proudly, authentically Indian political philosophy is that it's composed in equal parts of medieval Islamic theology and early modern political theology and early modern European nationalism. That's what it is. You may say it's more European nationalism and fascism and less Islamic, but I think it's probably a combination of both. So there's nothing indigenous about Hindutva. And of course, it's what it will do to our country is visible to all of us. Now, for people like me, and for, I suppose, some people in this room, the battle today is the BJP and the RSS versus the Indian Constitution and the heritage of the freedom struggle, between Jingoism and Patriotism. Where I might differ from some people in this room is that I don't believe that to express my patriotism, I must hitch my wagon to an alternate political party, let alone an alternate political leader. Patriotism, as I have already said, is an everyday affair. It's not by all means, vote once in 5 years, and but it's everyday affair. In the absence, even today, as appears, of a suitable or effective or credible party vehicle to carry forward the legacy of the Indian freedom struggle, because we must still, as citizens, in whatever way we can, continue to affirm and uphold and persist with our affirmation of that original tradition of Indian patriotism. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Is it on?
Is it on? No.
Yeah, it's on now. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ram, for such an insightful keynote. I'm just going to raise a few questions before we throw it open to the audience to talk to you. You spoke about, right at the end, and I'll start from there, about persisting with our idea of nationalism that comes from the freedom struggle, from a Catholic perception of what this land is. But the reality is that fear and hate, two sides of the same coin, are instilled in everybody today, irrespective of which side of the political domain they live in. These two things are so instilled that even some basic relationships today are very difficult. Could be families, could be friends, let alone the larger spectrum of the nation or even the district or the town. So my question to you is, one of the greatest battles is this battle of hate and fear, which I think is both personal, internal, and in terms of relationship. So in this atmosphere, my question to you is, how does one persist?
So, it's a very important question, and I'll duck it a bit because I don't believe in advocacy. I believe in research, analysis, understanding, and communicating my research and understanding in as many fora as possible. Even though I write in English, my column comes in 10 different newspapers and languages. So, the how I can explain why we've got here, try and explain what we got here, try and see what happens to other countries around the world, draw lessons from history. But it's a very legitimate question, and young people often write to me saying, sir, what should I do? And of course, having I don't even dare to advise my own children on how they should live their lives. So I think I'd say this. I'd say this. I think it's very important, and the space you have here, I think it's very important to have spaces in what used to be known as civil society. Now again, let me answer your question with a historical detour, not directly. One of the ambitions of the current regime, we know one nation, one election, one religion, one language, one vaccine certificate, etc. But there's something else which is more insidious than all of the above for democracy and for citizenship, which is the theme of your what you're curating. It is one NGO. Only the RSS and its affiliates. That's the reason we have the attacks on FCRA and everyone else. One NGO. And that we can all resist that, by creating spaces like this, where we have conversations, by nurturing, by people of different backgrounds, they just come together, a peace march where it's possible, door-to-door campaign where it's possible. And at this is something where, I think again, sorry to bring in, but maybe not sorry because that's what I know. bring the heritage of Gandhi here. See, I mentioned Jamnalal ji. If Jamnalal ji had been alive, he and people like him would have made sure there was an active civil society movement as well. What happened after independence was that a whole bunch of Gandhians went into running the state, which they had to. I mean, Gandhi was quite clear. The state had to be run by people like Nehru and Patel and Azad and Ambedkar. But he would have also hoped for a vigorous civil society movement to keep the state honest. And for a variety of reasons I won't go into here, that role, and Gandhi never identified a successor in the civil society movement. He identified Nehru and Patel as successors. Vinoba Bhave usurped that role and destroyed the Gandhian civil society movement. I mean, I'll have to come and give I made a controversial statement, but I'm happy to defend it. And you can call me back again and I'll give you a 1-hour lecture on how Vinoba Bhave destroyed the Indian or deeply damaged the Gandhian civil society tradition through the 50s and 60s. It was, he took it in a very... Vinoba Bhave went on a fast, several fasts on cow slaughter. He never went on a fast on Hindu-Muslim harmony or untouchability, just to say nothing else. And it's only in the 70s, with, for example, Seva, Ela Bhatt has just died, the environmental movement, Chipko, and then, of course, Tilonia and the Barefoot College and many other things came up. So we lost 2.5 decades, and now those activists are now all getting old. They don't have the energy naturally that they had 40, 50 years ago. Young people live on their smartphones. So nurturing civil society spaces, I think, is very, very important. I think that's something which is of whatever kind. It could be, G5A, it could be Friday for the Future, it could be, there's a small organization, Karnataka, non-political organization talking about linguistic and religious pluralism, whatever. I mean, that is, because I think this is, democracies need, democracy is not only about individual rights, though it is about individual rights. It's not only about free and fair elections, because that's about two. It's about collective action, voluntary action at whatever level. I think that's where, and that is what this regime does not want. They actually want thought control. They want one NGO. And I think that's where we have to push back.
Thank you for that non-direct answer to my question. I will ask you a historical question. You spoke about federalism, and, well, I come from a state where this is one of the biggest pushbacks is coming from the state of Tamil Nadu. Yeah. So I don't know how many of you know that the Tamil Nadu government officially does not use the term central government anymore. Mm-hmm. So in Tamil, we call it the Undriya Arase, which basically means union government. And it's the only state in this country that has changed that language. Yeah. And you'll see the chief minister making it a point. Yeah. So my question is this idea of federalism and in terms of the constitution. Yeah. Of course, there was a context to it. There was the partition and there was a fear of separations of various sorts within the land and of course. But now in retrospect, seeing that these operations of various one is happening, this idea of cooperative federalism seems more something that is very beautiful to talk about than really functional in terms of how you can exist as a country. And in some way, that is what is being taken advantage of, whether it's education or whether it is any other field. Now they want the Aadhaar card to be connected to health data, for example, which is completely got to the states. Yeah. So did we make a mistake there? Because we truly did not embrace federalism. I'm not comparing to Australia or America or the United States.
I think there were some legitimate grounds why Nehru and Ambedkar and Patel favored a strong center in the backdrop of partition. And not just partition, a communist insurgency, the princely states problem and so on. And I think what happened over a period of time, and I think again here, I think 1991 is important. I think, again, as you can see, I'm not a party man at all. I differ from Congress fans about the family. And I differ from the left on many things, including their obsessive hatred of free enterprise. And I think 1991 is very important because it brought about, a vigor to states like Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra and Karnataka and so on, who could leverage the good work they'd done in education, health, and then to take advantage of a free market economy. Now, that is being undone partly because now what we are, again, this is where India is becoming like other countries. Like Russia particularly. Now there's oligarchy. What Arvind Subramanian has called the 2A model of stigmatized capitalism. And I don't need to explain to you who the 2As are. So I think what was happening in 1990 was two things. One was on the economic side, the dismantling of the license permit quota Raj, long overdue. On the political side, the fact that there were no majority governments. Our best hope today is that in 2024 we do not hand the BJP a majority. I don't think that they're going to go right, and that's our best hope for our society, for our economy, and for our federalism. That if you have different people represented. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is where we also failed was to further transfer power from the state, to the districts and the cities, and I think that's a debate that has now been aborted. Panchayati Raj was one of Rajiv Gandhi's good measures, not in the implementation, but at least in the conception. And so I think if we reach a phase where, we're going to raise, but before I'm optimistic, we're going to face just 4 years down the road a major crisis in Indian democracy, which is when the freeze on the allocation of Lok Sabha seats will be undone, and UP and Bihar will get many more seats than Kerala and Tamil Nadu and so on, and what that will do to the federal structure. But it's like, so I think again, it is worrying, and because it is some ways, in 1991, when the Soviet Union broke down because of too strong and brutal a center, and whose ramifications are still playing out in the war in Ukraine, in the same year we actually started losing up, and after 2014 that has changed. Now, is this change irreversible? I don't know. I'm very happy for what Tamil Nadu particularly, and Kerala and West Bengal and now Bihar and to some extent Maharashtra, are doing to question this idea of one nation, one everything, right? Because I think it's not just from a political point of view, but from an economic point of view. Look at, since I'm speaking in Bombay, does anyone believe that these two major projects that went to Gujarat, that had nothing to do with who is Prime Minister and who's Home Minister? Does anybody here believe it? Okay, so, and it's like, so in that sense, that kind of undermining of state autonomy has deep economic costs. And I think which is why probably we don't, majority governments are bad for India.
Finally, even if you look at the past, whether it is Gandhi or Ambedkar or Periyar, for example, or anybody else, this articulation of ideas, for example, the notion of freedom, or could be anything, one important thing they were able to bridge, I feel, is to think of it as an abstract idea at a personal level. Yeah. And also in terms of its actual material functioning in society, whether it is political or social or relationships. Now, somehow that culture is completely gone from our political environment. We have vote catchers. Yeah. We have people in the politics, and I'm not talking about just maybe people who are standing for elections, but around the culture of politics. And how much has that played a role in our lack of articulation of, say, the larger ideas, whether it is the idea of freedom coming from the freedom struggle, because we don't have that kind of individuals or that kind of processes to articulate a counter to what is a very homogeneous and attractive intoxication.
No, it is, because the narrative, but I'll say this, and I've said this before. If the Gandhis retired from the Congress party and politics, you will find the discourse changing. Nehru will not be mentioned by any union minister again. And I'm serious. I'm dead serious. And no one will, see, what happens today is, oh, you are suppressing the press. Nehru brought First Amendment. Oh, you are weak on China. Look what Nehru did. You are harassing dissidents. Look what Indira Gandhi did. You are taking money on defense deals. Look at Rajiv Gandhi did. I tell you, there are these without, it's not their fault. It's the fault largely of their chamchas. But it is, the disease, the discourse is totally distorted because you just shifted that way. And it's never about the present, it's about the past. And it completely suits them, uh, to have a descendant of Nehru as the de facto leader of the Congress party, uh, and along with his sister and mother, because they don't know how to talk of the president. It's always about the past. I mean, so in a sense that they are, it's really, if you look at the history of autocracies, there are joint script. There is an authoritarian and there is allies who presume to be his opponents, who claim to be his opponents. That's true of, that's true of Russia in the Germany in the 30s, true of Italy. Of course, it's true of, it's true of the Democratic Party. It is just, look, again, to just underline this point, because I'm interested in comparative stuff. Look at what happened to England once Corbyn was removed. I mean, the cult of Bojo collapsed. I tell you, if the Gandhis were to exit politics today, this country would have hope. They are not the principal cause of where we are. The principal cause are Modi and Shah and the RSS. Let me be clear about it. But this is also, by the way, I talk about the left. I tell you about the left. The left has exercised, the communist left, a pernicious influence on how we view the world. Because the left, from the time of Lenin and Mao, has believed in something called the principal contradiction and the secondary contradiction. There's a main enemy, and all of you get together against the enemy. To forget about who you are allying with and where you are. And that's so, in that sense, a lot of the battle is electoral, but a lot of the battle also is something else I've been thinking about a lot. It's not just electoral, it's, it's social and individual. Yeah. The kind of, when you talk about collective action, civil society work, serious reflective debate, and how this has been imperiled by the personal phone. It's quite extraordinary. I think the sociological and psychological and political consequences of 500 million Indians on their phone. And not just because they are consuming WhatsApp history. That's only part of it. A sense of fraternity is lost. Yeah. It's like, how do you have, how do you have spaces where you see other human beings and you talk to them and interact with them and understand them, their background and their suffering, and relate to them and tell them about your background and your suffering, and together, I think this is something, technology, again, this is having said so many nasty things about the left. Let me salute Marx, because Marx was a great and original thinker. And it's not an accident that towards the last years of his life, he said, I am not a Marxist. And one of his great insights was that technology is an autonomous force. It's like, and I think this so-called, I think that's, it's like, so in that sense, how, fortunately, the thing is, I'll just make one last point, which I also cribbed from actually my son Keshava, which is that where he said, again in conversation, I've stolen lots of friends and family lines, but with attribution each time. He once said that things in India are never as bad or as good as they seem to be. In 2008, we thought we were becoming a superpower. We are challenging China, and this is our century, and so on. So they weren't that good, and maybe they aren't that bad. And places like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, and good luck to them, and good luck to all of us. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And before I open the floor out, you spoke a lot about the left, the communist left. I must say that I also think they don't understand art and culture. Now we may open the house out.
Good.
Just use the mic, the microphones.
So one thing I think about a lot and I'm not able to find an answer is, why are people at the bottom of the pyramid in India not so angry that they're like breaking our cars and, causing like a lot of chaos? Like, why is the anger not that much? Because they are treated so badly, like there are no salaries, there's no water, they're paying like crazy rents at, in just here in Worli. So, yeah, why do you think it has not happened? Yeah, we have protests and some of them get some partial success, but why is that anger not at that boiling point?
Well, I think one reason is that it has not been mobilized politically. Again, to attribute, with attribution a line that Prashant Kishore used after when the migrant crisis happened. He said some leader of the opposition should have walked with them for 3 days. Where were they? So you have had to have, you have to have that, so they have to have someone they can, that's one thing. The second reason could be that actually there's one area in which this government has delivered. In a limited way with welfare schemes. They allow you to survive. They won't give you dignity or a job, but they'll give you clean water, some sanitation, not as much as they claim, but more than any previous government has. And that particularly in places like UP. So just enough for you to be. And so it's, and of course there could be a long-standing religious apathy. Unlike China and France, as historians have written in the past, in medieval, there were peasant movements against the British, but virtually none against medieval rulers. So it's a complex thing. But I think the lack of a credible opposition, particularly an opposition face, because in the social media world, in the 21st century world, all elections, even those on the Westminster model, have become presidential. And I think, and again, you have to show this. So if, again, instead of his Bharat Jodo Yatra, which is a well-meaning exercise but unlikely to, yield any results at election time, if at that stage he had said, I'm going to walk with these migrants where they are and talk to them and empathize with them and bring their plight to the attention of people, then there's a connect, that you have someone. Modi at least tells you, I'm making, you see, Modi is actually, Modi never, there's an essay I wrote recently about how Modi's critics consistently underestimate him. That we do at our peril. He is not only phenomenally intelligent and hardworking, but he's a brilliant messenger. He's a motivational speaker. He's telling you the world is looking at India. Okay, maybe not tomorrow, but at least day after. But the world is looking at India. Sab log hamare baare mein baat kar rahe hain. So you have to have someone with a compelling message. This is where we are. Because the media world we live in today is about, once Corbyn was replaced, you had a real challenge there. Once, Bernie Sanders went, nice guy, but he would not have defeated Trump, but Biden did. It was more credible and reliable, right? So I think that's where we are trapped today. That I don't want to blame, I don't want to, dump on poor Rahul Gandhi excessively, for two reasons. One, he's not the main culprit, the guy's in para. And secondly, the poor fellow is just an instrument of his mother's will. And I mean this seriously, without having met the mother. This is what it is. He'd be much happier somewhere else. But that's where we are stuck. But at the same time, because of federalism, it's not as if they're completely hegemonic. I think two states will play a very important role politically in deciding the next election. Bihar and Maharashtra could be two large states where things could change. And once, there's something else I'd say. It's my belief, it may be a naive belief, but, I think the ruling regime knows that there's something khokla about it, something hollow. That's why they're going after everyone, including, so I think maybe, I think probably, young people are right. Things are not as bad. But you see, the thing is, why are people not protesting against injustice and inequality? If you look at the JP movement, you had JP. You had a person of enormous credibility. A person, a great hero of the freedom struggle, a selfless social activist for 25, 30 years, who could have been prime minister. Nehru wanted him to succeed him, and who decided to work with peasants and workers instead, and then comes back. So you would have to have, some crystallizing force would be needed. Crystallizing individual might be needed. And we don't have that person yet, but there's no saying that person won't come. Yeah. They're recording it, I think.
So my question really is, are there chinks? For example, do you think that this command and control deterministic model, has a long shelf life? perhaps we are at a point in history where the inexorable sort of force that is exerted by these people does not have a counter. But are there chinks? And I'm going to name a couple of them. The world is not headed in that direction, number one. There's going to be the slow train of the economy that's coming. You are going to see unemployment like never before in the next 20 years. India has never faced this, and it's never spilled onto the street. So what is your take on that?
I mean, historians can't be astrologers, so I wouldn't. But you're right. I mean, essentially, I just say this, that history has very few lessons to offer. One is that personality cults are bad for the country that fosters them. And the second is that there are no permanent winners and losers. And I think you're right. I mean, in the long run, but the damage that will to our institutions, to our social fabric, to our economy, to our environment. But I think yes. I mean, I think I'm now actually, though my talk may have given a different kind of, some of the remarks in my talk may have given a different kind of impression. I'm more hopeful than I was even 6 months ago.
But isn't this the inexorable march of history, as John Simpson once said? So, I mean, you cannot be deterministic about these
but
things.
we don't want to, I mean, we don't want to, one must minimize the damage and restore, a lot of what we lost in the meantime. I think
So my question is about education, and I don't mean, WhatsApp or Twitter, kind of learning from there, but kind of the more traditional school sense. So I go to a school where we learn in the IB system. It's a very expensive school, to be honest. And for each unit that we learn, we do something called historiography, which we look at many different perspectives, including yours when we studied the Indian freedom movement. And I have, as a student of history, I'm acutely aware that I have multiple resources and multiple teachers and perspectives that I'm able to learn from. If I kind of look at India as a whole, and if you think of primary education, secondary education, and textbooks and things like that, that is not kind of the reality for the majority. People learn from in various communities in a more, I guess, linear way. What role through history, if any, has education played in perpetuating Jingoism, and what role do you think will it play?
So I think, no, of course, at the, not so much at the school level, because I don't think, I mean, so firstly, you're absolutely right about, I mean, our greatest failure since independence is probably our primary education, the hierarchy of the differential education system. And in some ways, Nehru himself is to blame for it, because he didn't really give it the kind of emphasis he gave higher education. I think Gandhi would have been clearly focused on, if he had lived another 10 or 15 years, on fostering a movement for universal literacy. Now, again, I'm not really well equipped to answer your question, because I don't really interact much with school children. But I'd say this, that I don't think it's really at a different level that you pick up. It's more adults who are having their minds communalized by WhatsApp history. It's like, and of course, some of it is a response to, again, a certain monochromatic or a somewhat disingenuous and sometimes even dishonest left-wing view of history. So many years ago, I had a debate with Amartya Sen in the page of the Economic and Political Weekly. And if you've not seen it, I urge you to follow it. Because I pointed out that his vision of history is Akbar good, Aurangzeb bad. And so we should treat Muslims as equal citizens today. So I simply pointed out, what if we had acknowledged that Aurangzeb was bad, or that there is no one paradigmatic ruler, and really talk about the present, about the constitution. So there was a lot of whitewashing of, and what this has led to, for example, today, is the whitewashing by the left, or sections of the left, of religious fervor among Islamic rulers, has resulted in a complete whitewashing of Hindu rulers. See, I went to a bookshop today, and it's all about the Cholas and so on. And does anyone know how women and Dalits were treated under the Cholas? Right. Okay. Now, so I think the important thing, the way to distinguish between today's constitutional imperatives and what may or may not have happened in the past uh, is something where, in many ways, historians in my camp played into their side because he said, no, 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 actually, Akbar was the originator of Indian secularism. Actually, Akbar, as I pointed out in my piece on Sen, was never mentioned in the Constituent Assembly once. It's, the idea that Akbar, Ashoka, this was the makers of the Indian Constitution were reacting to how India was in the 20th century, which is very similar to where we are now. So I think in some ways, the idea that you can foster a more caring citizenship by, a different slant of the past, it's led us to a situation today where, as I said, today, I believe, for example, to go back to where we are today, like in this city, I think the glorification of Shivaji is crazy. Not just Tipu Sultan. I got into trouble because I said we should not glorify Tipu Sultan. Why? Because we are a republic. We should not glorify any ruler, whether Hindu or Muslim or Buddhist. Absolutely not, because we are not a monarchy. We are, though, ironically, both Narendra Modi and Sonia Gandhi think in different ways that we are a monarchy. But so in that sense, but it's a difficult. I'm sorry, I'm not answering your question adequately, but it's very difficult to citizenship. It's what citizenship must be based on: present needs, present aspirations, present values, present concerns. History is about something else. But again, I don't think really that what the history per se. I think we should not accord too much importance to history. Historians are chroniclers and witnesses. They're not activists, nor do they, except at rare occasions, transform people's consciousness.
Well, we'll have to end here because we have we have a performance after this.
One last question.
Want to take one last one?
It'll be a short one.
Yeah.
So I recently read this on Twitter that really made me think. It said, when you look at news today, how false the news is makes you question how accurate history is. Do you agree to that sentiment?
See, history is not science. History is somewhere in between art and science. It's a craft, right? You're approximating to, you are dispelling untruths rather than promoting truths. That's really how I see history.
Thank you very much. We'll have to stop here. I'd like to thank Ramachandra Guha for this wonderful evening. And thank you for starting off this festival in a note that is going to make many people think and question you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much.